On a cold November morning in 1095, Pope Urban II made a speech that would change history. He was preaching in an open field to a crowd of churchmen and regular people in a town in southwestern France. He called for the knights of Western Europe to rescue Jerusalem from the control of the Seljuk Turks and to bring aid to Eastern Christians who were suffering abominable cruelties at the hands of these new Muslim invaders. These are some of the words that the Pope is reported to have said on that morning. A race absolutely alien to God has invaded the land of Christians, has reduced the people with sword, rapine, and flame. These men have destroyed the altars polluted by their foul practices. They have circumcised the Christians, either spreading the blood from the circumcisions on the altars or pouring it into the baptismal fonts. And they cut open the navels of those whom they choose to torment with loathsome death, tear out their most vital organs, and tie them to a stake, drag them around and flog them before killing them as they lie prone on the ground with all their entrails out. What shall I say of the appalling violation of women, of which it is more evil to speak than to keep silent? On whom, therefore, does the task lie of avenging this, of redeeming this situation, if not on you, upon whom, above all nations, God has bestowed outstanding glory in arms, magnitude of heart, litheness of body, and strength to humble anyone who resists you? Now, the outcome of this speech was a remarkable response from knights and nobles across Western Europe. They came from France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and even Germany. They readied themselves for a trip to the Holy Land, inspired by a mixture of religious fervor and military ambition. This armed expedition became known as the First Crusade, and it would have a profound effect on the identity of Europe and its relationship with the Middle East. In many ways, its echoes can still be heard today. It's an astonishing tale of heroism, brutality, vengeance, suffering, and victories over the most unlikely odds. But what was the First Crusade, and why was it so important? You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the first of a couple of episodes on the First Crusade. But before we get into the story for today, I need to pause and say a special note of thank you to those people who make this podcast possible, especially by supporting it on Patreon. Most especially those people who are supporting the podcast on Patreon at the highest level, who include Richard Hubner, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, Gordon Carl, and Agnes Weiner. Thank you so much for making it possible to make more episodes like this. And if you would like to see even more history from Villains and Virgins podcast, consider heading over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert, where you get access to additional content around each episode, live conversations after the release of each new episode, and other history facts. The First Crusade is almost legendary. There are stories about it that have been passed down over the centuries of brave knights afire with religious fervor and devious Easterners, both Greeks and Muslims, who have to be overcome. There's an argument for saying that it crystallized a version of Western identity that would then resurface again and again for several centuries thereafter. Most of all, it fused Christianity with violence, initiating an idea of holy war in which violence wasn't just permissible, but actually an act of piety done in the service of one's faith. This story contains the full gamut of human behavior, from heroism to barbarism. There's cannibalism, rape, murder, starvation, suffering, as well as incredible courage. There are many bizarre episodes in this story, and it's one of the largest mass movements in the medieval period, involving, by some estimates, some 100,000 people who migrate from Western Europe into Turkey and the Middle East. What a lot of people don't realize is that historians look at the First Crusade as actually two separate crusades. One of them we'll call the Prince's Crusade, and the other one, its more unruly, chaotic shadow, is called the People's Crusade. And both of these migrations, both of these groups, are operating pretty much simultaneously, responding to the call of this First Crusade. So we are talking about the First Crusade only, but under that banner, there are two separate sort of movements that are going on. And the power of two is going to pervade this entire story, because we don't just have two separate groups of crusaders, we also have two popes in this story, two different emperors, and even two different versions of Christianity. So I'll do my best to navigate between these doubles that persist throughout the entire story, but you're going to have to pay close attention. But before we can get into that, we need to back up a little bit and understand the state of the world in 1095 and some of the events that had happened in the couple of decades prior to it, in order to set the stage for this incredible crusade that's going to unfold. In particular, we need to understand the relationship between the Pope who called for this crusade and the emperor who asked him to do it. So in 1054, almost 4 decades before Pope Urban makes this call for crusade in 1095, the Christian world suffered a momentous split. Historians refer to this as the Great Schism. And what happened is that the Christian world divided into a Western and an Eastern half. And this is a split from which it's never recovered. So what happened? The Christian world at this time closely corresponded to the shape of the Roman Empire, because Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire by this point. The western half of the Roman Empire, which included territories that we would now call France, Germany, and Italy, succumbed much more quickly to pressure from what the Romans called barbarian tribes. So it ceased to be effectively under Roman control. But the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which included Greece, Serbia, Asia Minor, and some small territories in southern Italy, stayed organized much, much longer, including right up to 1095, which is the point where we have the First Crusade taking off. So they called themselves the Eastern Roman Empire. Historians have sometimes referred to them as the Byzantine Empire. Same people, but they saw themselves as Romans. So in 1054, at the moment that the Christian world divides, there's a contest of religious authority. The Bishop of Rome, which is no longer in the Roman Empire, but the Bishop of Rome believes that he should have the preeminent place of leadership in the Christian world. And he's developed a theory about why this is the case, but he thinks that he should have this highest status and the ability to determine what is doctrine and correct practice. In the East, there have been a number of other church leaders who have traditionally had the same status as the Bishop of Rome. And they are in Antioch and Constantinople and Jerusalem. There were in fact 5 sees or territories that were dominated by these extra high-ranking bishops in the church. So the Bishop of Rome was just one of them. And he was now claiming the preeminence of place to decide what the shape of Christianity should be. And in the East, they said, not so fast. Your authority is significant, but we also have other people here who are your equal. So in 1054, there's a split because the Bishop of Rome insists that he should have this position, and the churchmen in the East say no, and there's a mutual excommunication. The Pope's representatives go to Constantinople, they argue, and they basically say, the church leaders in Rome are outside of the church, and anyone who recognizes them is outside the church as well. We don't recognize you guys as Christians. we are not going to have anything to do with you. And the Eastern Church returns the favor and says the Bishop of Rome and those people who recognize his authority are also misguided and outside the fold. And so there is this horrendous division that happens. And by the time we get to 1095, it's relatively recent. It's been going on for 4 decades, but there's been this sort of separation in which we now have a Western Latin half of the church, which recognizes the Pope as its highest authority, and we have an Eastern Orthodox half of the church, and they recognize what they call patriarchs and church councils as their source of authority. So these are the 2 types of Christianity that exist in 1095. And by the way, on Villains and Virgins podcast, we've done a whole series on the Great Schism. So if you're interested in more detail on this particular episode in history, go check out that series. So the Christian world has never recovered from the Great Schism of 1054. But what's really interesting about this First Crusade is how close we came to healing that breach and how different history might have looked had that succeeded. So this is what was going on. First of all, Pope Urban II, the one who calls for crusade, is actually not the only pope in the Western Latin Church at this time. There are 2 popes that are claiming to be leaders of the Western Christian world at the same time. How can this be, you wonder? Well, it's very political, as you might have guessed. So the Pope in Rome has long relied on the support of the Holy Roman Emperor. This is Emperor number 1 in our story. Who's the Holy Roman Emperor? Well, I said the Western Roman Empire collapsed, right? And then in the 700s and 800s, we have this Germanic tribe called the Franks that come to be closely allied to the Pope. He needs military muscle for security in Rome because there are all these other competing tribes that are taking up territory and are raiding and thieving and killing people. So the Pope makes an alliance with the Franks, and he says, if you defend me and provide security, I will name your king this new title of Holy Roman Emperor, which basically makes you kind of the inheritors of the mantle of the Western Roman Empire, even though we're looking at several centuries after it has essentially collapsed. So the Holy Roman Emperor is always going to be a Frankish king who gets this crown from the Pope. The Pope and the Frankish kings have had some controversies in the past few decades over who gets to elect bishops. So bishops are very important officials in the church, but in the medieval world, they also hold territory. They're landowners. They come from noble families. It's a desirable position with a good income attached to it, which comes from the rents of that land that are attached to the title. And so the ability to appoint bishops is something that both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor want to be able to do. The Pope says, well, I should appoint the bishops because they're church officials, and they answer to me because I'm in charge of the Western Christian Church. And the Emperor says, I should be able to appoint the bishops because the bishops in my territory, are answerable to me as the highest political authority in my empire. I don't want them listening to some guy over there in Rome. I want them to be my guys, and I want to be able to hand out the position of bishop as a reward to families who are loyal to me. Historians call this the investiture controversy. Who gets to invest somebody with the office of bishop? So different popes and different Holy Roman emperors have been fighting about this, and it turns out that the Holy Roman Emperor decided, I've had enough. So his name is Henry IV. He rides down into Rome and he says, this pope is too troublesome. I'm going to get rid of him. I'm going to put my own papal candidate, my own pope, on the throne of St. Peter in Rome, and he is going to be agreeable to me. So I'm not going to be fighting with the Pope anymore about investing bishops in my empire. He's going to do what I say, and I can invest the bishops I want. So the Holy Roman Emperor puts a guy called Clement III on the papal seat in Rome. Meanwhile, Urban II has been elected as Pope by people who are not answerable to the Holy Roman Emperor. So we have two different people both claiming to be Pope at the same time. The Emperor's candidate, Clement, is sitting there in Rome, and he's supported by Frankish military muscle. And then there's Urban II, who's sitting farther south in Italy, who's also claiming to have this office. And so it's a competition for legitimacy. The Holy Roman Empire, the parts of Europe like Germany that are answerable to the Holy Roman Emperor, they recognize his candidate as Pope. So they think Clement III is the leader of the Christian world. But other parts of Europe, including France, southern Italy, and the Netherlands, for example, they're looking at Urban II. And so we see these two popes both writing to Christian communities farther afield, some of them in Kiev. Clement III from Rome is writing to Christians in Kiev, trying to assert his position as their leader. Meanwhile, Urban II is writing to Constantinople. He's writing to the other emperor. So who's the other emperor? Well, he's the emperor of Eastern Rome, also called the Byzantine Empire. Eastern Rome hasn't collapsed. So we've got the Holy Roman Emperor up there in the north in Germany, and then we've got the Roman Emperor, or the Byzantine Emperor, still ruling part of the Roman Empire, and he's sitting in Constantinople, which we now call Istanbul, same city. So Urban II, this pope, is writing to the emperor in Constantinople, the emperor of Eastern Roman Empire, and trying to expand recognition of his status, trying to build bridges, trying to increase his legitimacy. So who is this emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire anyway? Well, he was a guy called Alexius Comnenus I. And he's the first because he was just recently a general who overthrew the last Eastern Roman emperor and took the throne for himself. So he's kind of a usurper, and he has to struggle to ensure that his newly found grip on the imperial throne doesn't slip. So he's also a man in search of legitimacy. Religion seems to be a priority for Alexius Comnenus I. His daughter Anna, who writes a history of this period called the Alexiad, has this report of the emperor staying up late at night with his wife to study scripture at night. So she portrays her father as this intensely religious man. Now, whether or not he was is sort of beside the point. Religion is very much part of his public face. It's part of his policy. It's a strategic priority for him. As a result, when the emperor receives a letter from Pope Urban II in 1088, trying to open a conversation around the schism that had split the Western and Eastern Church, he's very receptive. He actually responds quite warmly. He says that this division amongst Christians is regrettable, that he himself desires unity in the church. And so he makes these very warm noises, and then he gets the highest ranking churchman of the Eastern Christian world, the Patriarch of Constantinople, to also write a letter to Urban II. And this patriarch says, yes, I know my predecessor excommunicated your predecessor, and you excommunicated my predecessor, and there was all of that unfortunate diplomatic ruckus, but really, I also desire unity. I'm not your enemy. Let's have a conversation. And so there's this wonderful window of opportunity that opens up here, where there's talk of organizing a joint church council where Eastern churchmen and Western Latin churchmen can get together in Constantinople and discuss the matter. There's even an Eastern churchman who's commissioned by the Patriarch to write a paper about these doctrinal disputes that have led to this serious division of the Christian world, and essentially minimize them and say, really, these aren't such big differences. They're not really a hill to die on. We can find a way back. So while these promising diplomatic conversations are going on, things begin to fall apart politically for Emperor Alexius Comnenus. And by 1095, he writes a very different kind of letter to Urban II. And this is a letter that is requesting urgent military aid. So the Eastern Roman Empire had been in trouble for quite some time. It was facing increasing pressure from tribes coming down from the steppe. There were these guys called the Pechenegs. They were incredibly vicious, very effective fighters, a constant headache to the Byzantines. They were always skirmishing on the borders and eating up, taking pieces of territory for themselves. They were under pressure from the Normans, who you might have heard of. Normans were basically Norsemen, sometimes formerly working as Vikings, who went and settled in France and began speaking French, and that's when they're called Normans, but they retained their savagery and their military effectiveness. So the Normans by this point have actually shown up in southern Italy. And for more on that, you can look at our series on the Normans in Italy, where there's multiple episodes about this. But from southern Italy, some of these Normans have even begun to attack territory that belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, some of the territory they took in southern Italy used to belong to the Eastern Roman Empire, so they've taken that, and they're actually going for the mainland as well. So there's pressure coming from these different fronts, but now suddenly there's a new problem. And this problem is the Seljuk Turks. Now the Turks are Muslims, but they're relatively new Muslims. They've come down from the Eurasian steppe, and maybe you can think of them as Mongols several hundred years before the Mongols showed up, because they have a lot of similar features. They are extremely good on horseback. They're the sort of people that you would say were born on horseback. It's as though there's no division between the rider and the horse that he's riding. They move seamlessly as one in a way that just baffles other armies that encounter them. And they've also mastered the art of archery on horseback. So they can ride incredibly well and also turn and shoot you over their shoulder or shoot you really, really quickly, multiple arrows in quick succession, with devastating effect on armies they encounter who are not used to these tactics. So the Seljuk Turks are sweeping from the east toward the west. They are basically invading parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, putting pressure on the emperor. So Alexius Comnenus is a new emperor. He's taken the throne for himself, and as a result, his hold on this office is dependent on him being effective and on solving the problems that are facing the empire. And by 1095, he's in serious trouble. Curiously though, the Seljuk Turks weren't always the nightmare that they had become for the emperor in 1095. In fact, in the previous decade, from 1081 to 1085, we see Emperor Alexius Comnenus actually making an alliance with a Seljuk Turkish chieftain by the name of Suleiman. And it goes so far as the two of them recognizing a line which divides what should be Eastern Roman Empire territory from Seljuk Turk territory. And we see the emperor actually getting military aid from Suleiman, this Seljuk Turk. He sends some Turkish soldiers to fight alongside the emperor's troops when he's taking care of the Pechenegs or fighting against the Normans or whoever else his problems may be. Now, those Turkish troops have to be paid, of course, but there's this sort of alliance that is formed. Really surprising, given the fact that the Seljuk Turks are going to be the big bad enemy in the story of the First Crusade that's about to unfold here. So just a few years prior to this, we have this multi-year alliance between a Seljuk Turkish chieftain, Suleiman, and Emperor Alexius Comnenus. Even to the point where we see Suleiman retaking key cities that belong to the Eastern Roman Empire, such as Nicaea and Antioch, as an agent of the emperor. Now, this is kind of a murky thing. It's something that the emperor tried to keep secret, because the story that was sent to the west was that everything had suddenly collapsed and the Turks had taken over these territories and it was a disaster. But actually, This Turkish alliance had been used to retake some of these cities in the emperor's name, and Suleiman worked alongside imperial policy for a while. So what happened? Well, after 1085, Suleiman died, and his successors, other Seljuk Turks, had no respect for this alliance. So once again, we see Seljuk Turkish forces aggressively taking over Byzantine or Eastern Roman territory, and the emperor is once again in a lot of hot water. And it wasn't just the emperor of Constantinople who was worried about the Seljuk Turks. Actually, the Muslim caliph in Baghdad was worried about these new Turkish fighters. So this is another really interesting thing, because we tend to view the Crusades through a long lens which leaves out a lot of this detail. And we think of the Crusades as the Christian world against the Muslim world. That's just not accurate, okay? What happened here was the Turks, who were Muslims, were nevertheless newcomers, and they were eating up territory, some of which belonged to other Muslim groups, pre-existing Muslim groups. So the Muslim caliph in Baghdad, modern-day Iraq, is worried about losing some of his territory to these Turkish newcomers. So this caliph actually makes diplomatic overtures to the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Comnenus, and says, hey, maybe we should make a deal. Maybe you should send your daughter to marry my son, and we should have a military alliance so we can keep these Turkish crazy guys contained, because they really are a serious threat to regional stability. So it's a much more complicated diplomatic and military picture than you might imagine. So with Emperor Alexius Comnenus unable to stop these Turkish warriors from taking increasingly larger pieces of his territory, the citizens of the empire were beginning to think that maybe they needed a new emperor. So his very hold on power itself was in danger of collapsing. There were palace intrigues and plots to overthrow Alexius Comnenus, which he managed to catch just in the nick of time, but the empire is on the verge of collapse, and his tenure as emperor may end at any time. So by 1095, it's really a disastrous situation. The emperor is holding on by his fingernails, as it were, and this is when he sends this desperate letter to Pope Urban II requesting Western military aid to secure the Eastern Roman Empire. So Pope Urban II is holding a church council in southern Italy when he receives this desperate letter from the emperor. And his response is conditioned by a number of factors. First of all, if he was able to respond positively and bring Western military aid to the emperor in Constantinople, it would make it much more likely that they could resolve the Great Schism. If Pope Urban II could be the man who finally healed the rift between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, that would redound to his unending credit. So there's a personal angle on this that very likely made it extremely attractive to him. And secondly, if he could effectively bring Western nobles and knights into this cause, it would underline his own authority as the leader of the Western Christian world. Because remember, he's still competing against Clement III, the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany's candidate. So he's still struggling to get recognition from the parts of the Christian world that don't recognize him, and to strengthen it in those areas that might be wavering. If he can pull this off, he greatly enhances his position as the leader of the Western Christian world. Urban II likely thought that securing the Eastern Roman Empire, especially the Holy Land, was desirable, and that there would be some spiritual benefit to Western knights to undertake this cause that had religious overtones. So when Pope Urban II receives this letter from the emperor, he thinks carefully and strategically about it. And he actually plants the seeds for the crusade in advance before he officially makes the call public. He does this by writing to key nobles in France, which is the region where he himself grew up. Pope Urban II is a member of a French aristocratic family. That's his homeland. Those are the noble families that he's embedded in. He knows them well. So he writes to the Archbishop of Lyon. He writes to Count Raymond of Toulouse, who's an incredibly high-ranking noble, a prince really, in southern France. And he sends them personal letters detailing the need for Western military aid to the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, I'm calling these people French because it's going to be easier for you to keep track of what's going on here. But at this time, in 1095, they would probably have called themselves Franks. The thing about 1095 is that the countries we now know today, nation states like Germany and France and Spain, didn't exist. What we now call Germany was then part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it was a bunch of different duchies and regions like Bavaria and Saxony and Thuringia and so on. And France was places like Burgundy and Languedoc and so on. So it would be very confusing to keep track of the medieval names for all these places and the medieval titles or terms for the people who inhabited them. Spain at the time was called Iberia, for example, and people from there we would call properly Iberians, but I'm just going to call them the Spanish. And the people from France would have referred to themselves probably as Western Franks. The people in the Holy Roman Empire would have called themselves Eastern Franks, most likely. And when they get into the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greeks there are going to look at all these Westerners and call them Franks, making no distinction about whether they come from England or Spain or France or Germany. So it can get very confusing, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use more contemporary terminology so that you know roughly where on the map these people are from. If you want to know more about Eastern and Western Franks, you can check out the series on Villains and Virgins podcast, The Empire of the Franks, and get deep into the weeds on all of that. But we're going to move along with the story of the First Crusade here. So the Pope is writing these personalized letters to high-ranking nobles, but then he goes on a preaching tour across France. And this is where he really takes the message public. He's now addressing church councils, and he's preaching in fields in the open air for anybody to come and hear the call. And it's this sort of meeting that we get the most moving accounts of his call to crusade from this Council of Clermont, the church council he holds in southwestern France. And after the church council, he goes out into a field the next day and he gives this sort of public speech, which I read you an excerpt of at the beginning of this episode, where he makes the call to crusade public. And he says, all of you have a duty to take up arms and avenge these atrocities that are being committed upon Eastern Christians, and also to take back the holy city of Jerusalem, and to secure this for Western pilgrims who have been traveling to Jerusalem for centuries. It's a major, major site of pilgrimage in the medieval period. And it's a little bit deceptive, because when you hear the Pope talking about the need to secure Jerusalem, you get the sense that, oh, it's just fallen into Muslim hands and it's suddenly become insecure. That's not accurate. Jerusalem has actually been under Muslim control for the last 4 centuries. It's the Seljuk Turks who are the newcomers. So Jerusalem was under other Muslim rule for a long period of time, and Christian pilgrims had continued to come to Jerusalem on pilgrimage and visit. So the Muslim part wasn't new. The Seljuk Turkish part was the real threat that was driving all of this. But these sort of distinctions weren't part of the message to the average person in France. In featuring the image of Jerusalem so prominently in this call for crusade, Pope Urban II was hitting really strong emotional triggers for his audience, because everybody knew about the places in Jerusalem where Jesus is supposed to have walked and lived and been crucified and buried and so on. And people were still going and visiting these places. So even if one person hadn't themselves, they would have heard stories of this very frequently from many others who had made this journey. So it was very strongly emotive to invoke Jerusalem and these pilgrimage sites as in need of defense, as something that was a religious duty upon Western Christians to go and secure. And the Pope was building on this existing concept of pilgrimage, which is a difficult and dangerous journey towards a place with religious significance that confers spiritual benefits on the pilgrim. That's the most succinct definition of pilgrimage I can give you. And so the idea of going to Jerusalem was already very strong in the imagination of Western medieval Christians. And so the Pope is taking that existing draw and he's saying, go now to Jerusalem, but take weapons with you this time. This is going to be a pilgrimage, but it's going to be an armed pilgrimage. So you'll have all the existing well-known spiritual benefits of pilgrimage, in terms of removing some of the penalties for your sins and purifying your soul. All of those benefits will still apply, but we're now going to accomplish a military objective on top of that. And it was also pitched as solidarity with Eastern Christians. Christians who lived in Jerusalem, in other parts of the Holy Land, in the Eastern Roman Empire, all of whom were being oppressed and persecuted by these barbarous and vicious Seljuk Turks. They just called them Saracens or Muslims or pagans. They weren't very specific in their terminology, but those bad Muslims over there. And the Pope also promised that if anyone undertook this particular call, this armed pilgrimage that would become known as the Crusade, that they would earn personal salvation. And I quote, "If any of you make the journey, not for the desire of worldly goods, but for the salvation of your souls and the liberation of the church, you will be relieved of the penance for all of your sins, for which you shall be judged to have made a full and perfect confession." And he also said later, "If anyone dies in expedition for the love of God and of his brothers, let him not doubt that he will assuredly find indulgence of his sins and will participate in eternal life through the merciful compassion of our God." Unquote. So what the Pope is saying here is that if you answer this call, if you go on this journey, you're going to have the penalty for much of your sins removed. You're going to have all the spiritual benefits that you would normally expect from going to Jerusalem as a pilgrim at some other time. And if you meet the greatest misfortune, if you actually die on this pilgrimage, this armed pilgrimage that we're going to call a crusade, it's a direct trip to heaven. So you can be assured of your personal salvation. So no matter what terrible things you may have done in your life, this is an opportunity for redemption. But in addition to these amazing spiritual benefits, there was a not so subtle appeal to immediate financial benefit that was embedded in the Pope's message as well. He also said, quote, "This land which you inhabit," by which he meant the Kingdom of France, "shut in on all sides by the seas and surrounded by mountain peaks, is too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound in wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators." So he then goes on to promise much better returns from traveling to the Holy Land. He says, "Wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. That land which, as the scripture says, flows with milk and honey, was given by God into the possession of the children of Israel. Jerusalem is the navel of the world. The land is fruitful above others, like another paradise of delights." So he's not saying, take Jerusalem back and give it to the Jews. That's definitely not what he's saying. He's saying, Jerusalem is a paradise on earth. The land is rich and fertile. There's plenty there to sustain everybody. Instead of staying here in France, where you barely have enough food to survive, go on this trip to the Holy Land, where you can have much more material benefit. So there's an economic incentive here as well. And the Pope knows exactly what he's talking about, because in the last 3 years prior to this appeal in 1095, there have been some very hard times in Western Europe. They've seen drought, they've seen famine, and they've seen plague. So people are malnourished. Economic times are tough. It's so bad that in some cases people are thinking that this might be the end of the world. You know, there have been prophecies about plagues and famine and signs in the sky, and they've had all of these things. So people are suffering economically. They've seen a lot of their friends and relatives die due to disease. There's no prospect that next year's harvest is going to be any better. There have been several bad ones in a row. So when the Pope is saying, you'll have all these spiritual benefits. If you die, you're going to go straight to heaven. And if you don't die, you still have spiritual benefits. And guess what? You'll have enough to eat. You can probably help yourselves to the fat of the land. There is lots of wealth to go around over there. So with all of these benefits on offer, perhaps it's not surprising that the response was as strong as it became. In fact, when the Pope starts rolling out this message, he doesn't just do it personally. He then commissions other bishops and churchmen and he says, take up the call and spread it across Western Europe, which they do. And people begin to respond in numbers that even the Pope couldn't have imagined. Many, many more people are interested in this offer than the ones he was actually targeting. The Pope and the Emperor, remember, we're talking about the emperor back in the Eastern Roman Empire, Alexius Comnenus here. They want Western fighting metal. They want knights, they want seasoned men at arms, people who know how to wield their weapons, people who are going to be effective against these devastating Turkish warriors. That's who they want. But as this message starts being taken up and spread all across Europe, it reaches the ears of a far larger audience than the one that was intended. And so we begin to see the response get a little bit out of control. So first of all, there's a lot of enthusiasm from the nobles in Western Europe, and this is what the Pope intended. And interestingly enough, if you weren't in good standing with the church, you weren't welcome to participate. So as a side note, in 1095, the same year that this call begins to go out, King Philip I of France had actually been excommunicated by the Pope. He'd been a very bad man. Apparently, he put away his queen for being too fat. And he says, well, I'm the King of France, you know, if I don't like my queen, I might not be able to get a legal divorce, but I can certainly remove her from my bedchamber. So he gets rid of the queen, and he takes up with this woman called Bertrada, who's apparently very good looking, but nobody else has anything good to say about her. And it wasn't that the king had a mistress that was the problem, it's that he very publicly puts his wife aside and puts his mistress sort of in her place. So it was a divorce in all but name, and it's the public nature of this that got him into trouble. If he'd kept everything looking more or less the same on the outside, but had started sleeping with Bertrada, you know, quietly, it wouldn't have been an issue. But because he does this publicly, the Pope excommunicates him. He says, you have to get right with God, otherwise you're outside the church, you're outside of grace. So Philip II of France is in this uncomfortable position when the call to crusade goes out, and now he's under pressure from his nobles to say, hurry up and get your affairs in order. We want to go on this crusade. Don't you want to come? You're our leader. And so we actually see the King of France kind of backpedaling and saying to the Pope, okay, I'm willing to get rid of my mistress, put her aside formally if you'll lift the excommunication so that I can be involved in this. In the end, it's his brother, the King of France's brother, who goes on crusade. But it's interesting that the call for this was strong enough that it would stimulate the King of France to take these kinds of measures to try and get back in the Pope's good books. There are stories of other nobles who are sort of galvanized by the call to crusade, and one of them is this mighty Norman warrior by the name of Bohemond, who's apparently besieging a city in southern Italy, Amalfi, right on the coast, the same Amalfi coast you can visit today. So he's besieging Amalfi, and he sees some of these crusaders heading down to the ships on the ports of southern Italy, where they're going to travel from there across the water towards modern-day Istanbul or Constantinople. He sees them wearing garments with fabric crosses stitched on the front and the back and chanting Deus vult, which is Latin for God wills it. So the story has it that Bohemond is out there in the field on this military campaign, and he sees these crusaders heading down to the ports, and he says, "What is this?" and is immediately inspired to join them. So the story goes that he takes his best cloak, he gets it, he starts cutting it into long strips so that he can stitch a cross for himself on his own garments, and that his followers or his knights can do the same. And they just pick up stakes and join the Crusaders. This is a very inspiring story, but we have some evidence that Bohemond actually had already heard about the crusade and had already made up his mind to go, because he's made some financial arrangements before this moment when he sees the Crusaders go by and just decides to follow them. So it looked perhaps spontaneous to some of the people there at the time, but most likely Bohemond had already heard about this and decided it would be a good idea. So when they go by, he's already ready to take his guys and join them. And we're going to hear a lot more about Bohemond in this story. He's one of these legendary medieval warriors that becomes a very high profile in all of the serious fighting that goes on. So keep his name in your mind. He's also the son of Robert Guiscard, who's the Norman that comes into southern Italy and builds a Norman kingdom there, which then is extended into Sicily. So if you want to hear about his father, Robert Guiscard, go listen to Normans in Sicily on Villains and Virgins podcast. You'll hear all about him. But Bohemond is very much his father's son. He's very tall. He's got this sort of pale blonde hair, icy blue eyes, much taller than his contemporaries, and the sort of guy that people who met him say that even his laugh sounded like a threat. He was a really scary individual, even amongst people who were accustomed to fighting and war. So when he decides to go on the crusade, be assured you're going to hear about him again. He's sort of a hard guy to miss. So as Bohemond and the brother of the King of France and these other aristocrats and knights and their retinues are beginning to mobilize in France, these are the people that the Emperor and the Pope want to recruit. These are experienced fighters. And we're going to call these guys the Prince's Crusade, because they are the target audience for the crusade. They are the people that the Emperor expects, and the Emperor in Constantinople and the Pope are coordinating their efforts. They've jointly agreed on a departure date for the crusade of August 15th, 1096. So the call for crusade has been going out over the late summer and autumn of 1095, and this gives knights and nobles in the West time to organize themselves. They have to get their weapons and their retinues and their horses together. They have to make arrangements for how things are going to be managed at home in the months or years that they're going to be absent. And it also allows the emperor in Constantinople to make his own preparations, and these need to be massive and thoroughgoing. If you're going to bring a foreign army into your territory, you better have plans to feed them, because otherwise a foreign army just takes food and provisions and wealth from wherever they pass. And they're going to be experienced as invaders who are oppressive to your people if they're just raiding fields that they pass and grabbing animals and food from every village and city that they pass by. So in order to avoid that, which would have been a disaster, Emperor Alexius Comnenus needs to set up a very detailed plan and a network of how this Western army is going to be provisioned and fed and supervised to make sure they stay on mission once they enter imperial territory. So he goes so far as to get special markets set up that are just going to sell to the Crusaders. He's going to make arrangements to provision the leaders of the crusade personally, to provide them with finances, with corn and wine and meat for themselves and their immediate followers. Make sure markets are set up for everyone else in the army at regular intervals to purchase the food that they need. And he's also going to send special imperial welcome parties, which are going to consist of imperial military officers with Latin interpreters, because imperial military officers in the Eastern Roman Empire would have spoken Greek. But the knights coming from Western Europe are going to be speaking Latin as well as their own regional languages. So this could be a problem. Therefore, the emperor equips his welcoming party with Latin translators. So these imperial military officers will welcome the Western armies as they come in, will direct them towards the markets and the places where they're supposed to be provisioned and sleep, and also keep a close eye on them, so that if any of these Western knights or fighters begin to break off and decide to go raiding or thieving in the local territory, they have orders to intercept them and stop them with violence if necessary. So there's a very detailed preparation plan that has to be made, and the emperor needs some time to put all this into place. So that's why the date for the actual departure is August 15th, 1096, and the Prince's Crusade, the nobles and the knights that are being recruited by the Pope, know about this timeline, and the emperor is preparing for their arrival. But as I said, word is going to get a little bit out of hand, and more people than just the ones that the Pope and the Emperor want to invite are going to decide that they too want to answer the call for crusade. So remember that Pope Urban II isn't recognized as Pope everywhere in the Western Christian world. He's not recognized in the Holy Roman Empire, which we're going to call modern Germany, and parts of northern Italy. That is dominated by the Holy Roman Emperor, a Frankish king, and his own papal candidate, Clement III. That's the official pope in that part of Western Europe. But Pope Urban II has sent his word of crusade through the French church, and one of these guys is a French holy man called Peter the Hermit. So he hears the call to crusade, he sets off across France preaching it, and then he heads into modern Germany, the Rhineland, the Holy Roman Empire, the part that's dominated by that other pope. But Peter the Hermit is preaching this call to crusade, and he's remarkably effective. Apparently, by March 1096, he's already recruited some 15,000 people, and he's going to continue his progress across modern Germany and try to continue preaching in more cities to gather even more. So churchmen, including monks, bishops, and abbots, begin to respond. A few knights and petty nobles in modern Germany hear the call and are interested, but a huge number of regular people are also galvanized by this invitation, and they include petty criminals, they include farmers, shopkeepers, women, the elderly, families. There's a massive appeal to everyday people. And Peter the Hermit must have been very good at the emotive parts of the message, but he left out a lot of the logistics. He doesn't seem to have passed on that August 15th is the departure date, and he definitely didn't pass on the important requirement that if you didn't have fighting ability, you should stay at home. This was part of the Pope's original message, and Pope Urban II had discouraged noble women and churchmen from accompanying the crusade because he said, listen, if you can't wield a sword, you're not really going to be helpful here. This is an armed pilgrimage. You need to be able to fight. So that part of the message got lost in translation or lost in travel, and Peter the Hermit is setting people on fire to go to the Holy Land and make this pilgrimage and get all the spiritual benefits and rescue people from these terrible Muslim invaders. But he fails to mention that there's actually a plan here, there's a coordinated time to leave, and there's a certain degree of military ability that is required. So this massive response, including women, children, and the elderly, that begins to happen in modern Germany may strike us as really bizarre. I mean, what did these people think they were going to do against these Turks? If there's all the talk of Turkish Muslims inflicting horrible, horrible crimes on the residents of Jerusalem and Eastern Christians, what did these people think they were going to do about it anyway? So we have to take a couple of steps back to understand what might have been going through the minds of the thousands of people who decided to sign up for this crusade. So number one, the idea of going to Jerusalem, which is a big part of how this is pitched, is directly fitting into the existing concept of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which has been going on for centuries. So it didn't sound bizarre. Many people had heard of or knew personally people who had gone to Jerusalem as pilgrims, and so some of them may have seen this as just another pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but a really massive one. Another factor was the increasing popularity of apocalyptic ideas in parts of Western Europe at this time, and Germany was definitely one of these areas, so was France. Apocalyptic ideas are a belief that has resurfaced at multiple times in history that we're now at, or very close to, the end of the world. And the Christian version of this references specific details that show up in the book of Revelation in the Bible, it's the last book of the Bible, where the end times are depicted as a time of disasters, strange things in the sky, plagues, wars, massive amounts of death. And this was beginning to sound really familiar to the people who were living in Germany at this time, because they had just had 3 years of drought, plague, starvation, famine, and also some really, really strange things going on in the sky. There had been a solar eclipse. There had been a massive meteor. And so for many of these people, it seemed highly likely that the end of the world was soon to come. And in Christian prophecies, there's this idea that the end times can't come until Jerusalem is back in Christian hands. And so this call right now, in the middle of all these years of disaster, to put Jerusalem back under Christian control was sort of a logical next step so that Jesus could return and everything could be resolved. The end of the world could happen and the final judgment and so on. So it fit very neatly into a pre-existing apocalyptic stream of prophecy and panic that seemed to mirror the disasters that many of these people had endured in the last 3 years. And so for them, the sight of a massive comet in the sky just a few months before could either be a sign of really bad things to come, which would be an end times scenario, or God's favor upon this special mission, depending on where in the optimism-pessimism spectrum you might fall personally. So these people are poor, they're hungry, and they're afraid. And if you think that the world is about to end, you're maybe not so worried about paying your rents or planting your fields for next year. Maybe going on this pilgrimage and accruing a large amount of spiritual benefit and trying to assure your own personal salvation is exactly what you should be doing if the final judgment is just around the corner. But apart from apocalyptic ideas, there is also an economic motivation that many people would have looked around and said, we're starving. I've lost enormous numbers of people in my community, members of my family. There's nothing here for us. We don't even know if we're going to be able to survive off of next year's harvest. maybe going somewhere else, somewhere that's warm, the land of milk and honey, as the Bible describes it, and as many preachers would have described it too, sounds like a pretty good idea. Perhaps I won't starve there, so I'll get spiritual benefit from going on this journey. If I die, I go straight to heaven, and if I live, perhaps I won't be on the brink of starvation. So there had to be a large number of people that were motivated by those drivers as well. So because Peter the Hermit doesn't mention any of the logistical considerations, as people hear his sermons and they become inspired by this idea of going on an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they basically start organizing themselves in little bands and heading off. And there are some really bizarre stories about this. One source by the name of Albert of Aachen, who writes about 4 decades after these events, recounts that there was one group of rustics or peasants from Germany who thought that there was a goat and a goose that had been divinely inspired and appointed these animals as their guides to Jerusalem and, devoutly followed these animals. It's a ridiculous story, of course, and we should take it with a grain of salt. Whether Peter of Aachen witnessed this himself or whether he was telling a story to illustrate how uneducated, disorganized, and ineffective these people were, is perhaps the more likely scenario. That Albert of Aachen's following the goose, following the goat story is more about pointing out the type of people who are coming from Germany and how uneducated and ineffective and perhaps ridiculous he thought they were than it is about actually documenting a particular band of peasants. While these people who are leaving Germany on crusade are disorganized, they do have some shared ideas that are pretty horrifying. And before I get to that, I want to pause and say the people who are responding to Peter the Hermit, the people who are coming out of modern Germany with no sense of organization or timeline, these are the ones we're going to call the People's Crusade. So they're responding to the same call, but unlike the Prince's Crusade, which is populated by a large number of nobles and seasoned knights and fighters, the People's Crusade is what it sounds like, a broad swath of the population coming out of Germany with no sense of effectiveness or organization. So as they begin to make their way south through Europe and east, heading towards modern Turkey and Constantinople, they begin to wreak havoc on the Jewish communities they encounter in German cities. So there were incidences of massive pogroms against the Jewish communities of Cologne, Worms, Mainz, Magdeburg, Trier, and even Prague. So you'd get these gangs or mobs of would-be crusaders who'd be coming through these cities, and they would target Jewish communities, in many cases butchering them en masse, and then seizing their property, anything of valuable, any money, any jewelry, anything that they could carry or sell, and they would take this. Now, this raises a question. Why the Jewish communities? Why was this wave of crusaders coming through Germany targeting so many Jews? And historians say that there were thousands of Jews who died in these attacks, many of them killed by the would-be crusaders, and some of them killing themselves or their children when they saw the onset of these mobs coming through and heard reports from other cities of what was going on, because they thought, well, if we're going to die, I'd rather my child died quickly and cleanly, as painlessly as possible, at my hands, than at the hands of God knows what these people are going to do to them. So it's a really horrifying moment, and some historians pin this as the first pogroms, the first sort of massive organized campaigns of violence against Jewish communities. And of course, they wouldn't be the last. So why? First of all, in a lot of medieval Christian teaching, there is this repeated message that Jews killed Jesus. And so Jews as the enemies of Christ, Jews as the enemies of Christianity, this is something that is circulated not always, not uniformly, but there are some preachers that tend to weave this into their messaging. And so if you were talking about Jerusalem and you were talking about pilgrimage sites, Jewish people as bad guys could easily have come up in that messaging and would have done many times prior to 1095. But secondly, these communities had wealth that could be taken. And remember, a lot of the members of the People's Crusade, they're not well organized. They don't have a lot of money. How are they going to feed themselves as they go on this months-long or years-long expedition thousands of miles from home? They're going to need money to buy food, otherwise they're going to starve. So if they didn't have much, then targeting other people and taking their stuff was a way to provision themselves for the journey ahead. There are other indications that poverty was a major driver of the violence and the trouble that the People's Crusade generated, because when they get to the border with Hungary, they need to get safe passage from the King of Hungary to come through, because these are large numbers of people moving in these groups. And when they start stealing food from local communities in Hungary, raping people, taking their stuff, the Hungarians take a very dim view of this, even though the Hungarians are also Christians at this time. But just because this mob of people from Germany are also supposedly Christians going on some sort of crusade, if they're taking your food and raping your women, you're going to do something about that. So the Hungarians brought out the army and they killed large numbers of these People's Crusaders as they began to straggle across Hungary en route to their destination. So not all of them, but certainly significant numbers of People's Crusaders ran into this kind of violence in Hungary when there was a response to their lawless action. So it's interesting to note that some of the first heavy casualties of the People's Crusade are at the hands of other European Christians because of the things that they're doing as part of their Holy Crusade. So it gets very, very muddy and very complicated very quickly. By July of 1096, the first bands of the people who are part of this People's Crusade show up in Constantinople, and they arrive as a really unpleasant surprise to Emperor Alexius Comnenus. Remember, no one is even supposed to be leaving Europe heading his direction until next month, August 15th, and then it's going to take weeks or months for them to actually arrive in Constantinople. So when these people start showing up in July, he's definitely not expecting them. Not only because they're not on time, but because they definitely don't resemble what he asked for. He's looking for seasoned Western knights, highly effective mounted military muscle. What he gets is a disorganized, undisciplined mob who immediately start vandalizing churches on the outskirts of Constantinople itself and selling the lead back to the Greeks. Like, I'm going to damage your church, I'm going to take some of the metal that's valuable, and then I'm going to sell it back to you. Which again is a pattern that suggests that these people were not very well provisioned, didn't have much money, and were willing to do basically whatever seemed effective on the road to raise the funds that they might need. So for the emperor, this is kind of a disaster. If people are worried already about his leadership, and he's made this desperate call to the West for help, and then this mob, this vandalizing mob of criminals and peasants is what shows up, this is not a diplomatic success. So the emperor needs to get them out of the city as quickly as possible so that they're not causing problems for him directly. So Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul, is a city on the west side of a strait of water, which is called the Bosphorus. And the Bosphorus is sort of the line that divides Constantinople from Turkish-controlled territory at this point. And it's not a very wide stretch of water. It's a little over 2 miles at the widest point and closer to 750 meters at the narrowest point. So the emperor says to this mob from Germany, okay, I want you to cross this really narrow stretch of water and just sit on the other bank there. We're going to set up a camp for you in this city right here. Not Constantinople, the city just on the other side of the strait. Stay in the camp. Don't go anywhere else because you're going to run into Turks and that's going to be a big trouble for you. So stay put. I'll send my merchants over there regularly to keep you supplied. They'll sell you all the food that you need. Sit tight and wait for the rest of the Crusaders to arrive so that all together you can go off on this crusade. So this is what he instructs these people to do. And the first band is sort of sent over there, and then very soon Peter the Hermit, the original preacher of the People's Crusade, shows up in Constantinople with another band of these people. He gets an audience with the emperor. The emperor thanks him for his efforts, gives him some money for himself and some of his followers, and sends that band of People's Crusaders to join the one that's already arrived. And so they're starting to build up at this camp across the water from Constantinople. So the emperor has instructed these People's Crusaders to sit tight and wait until the members of the Prince's Crusade, the ones he's asked for, can arrive. But the People's Crusaders have no real centralized leadership. They have no discipline. They have no organization. So very quickly they get restless. And within 2 months, there are some French guys who go off cattle raiding. So they're now stealing from communities nearby. And then a bunch of them decide, why are we waiting here? We should just head off for Nicaea, which we know is the first city that is part of the strategy of cities that we have to take as part of this crusade. We know Nicaea is on the list, and Antioch afterwards, and then Jerusalem. So what are we waiting for? Let's head off to Nicaea. And allegedly some Germans, it's always the Germans, decide that there's a castle nearby that we should seize. The Turks have it, but let's take it from them. And we'll use that as a base for operations and start heading off to Nicaea. So already they're engaging in these activities that are not sanctioned by the emperor. They're not coordinated by any kind of central leadership, and they're going to lead to disaster. So they do succeed in taking a castle from the Turks, but the Turks quickly rally. They surround it with troops. They force the People's Crusaders inside to surrender within 8 days. And now the rest of the People's Crusaders, who are still sitting in camp and have heard about these guys who've sort of set off to take the castle, they're now just raring to fight. And they say, we need to go after the Turks. I mean, they've attacked our brethren in that castle. They're in trouble. We need to fight these people. And remember, there's no centralized organization. So they kind of go to the couple of knights who have some sort of rank amongst them, and they say, lead us into battle. Let's go. And the knights say, we should wait. The only guy who really has moral leadership of this group is Peter the Hermit, and he's just across the water in Constantinople talking to the emperor right now. Let's wait till he gets back and coordinate. But the peasants are having none of this. They're like, forget about coordination. We need to kill these Turks now. And so they do get the knights to form them up into about 6 divisions, and they face the Turks in an open field. And what do you think happens? So the Turks are seasoned fighters. These guys are absolutely devastating on horseback. They're fast. They can shoot arrows with incredible accuracy and speed. They're great at killing armies of veteran fighters. But the People's Crusaders are not veteran fighters. They're ordinary people. They are civilians for the most part. Whatever weapons they have are mostly improvised, and if they're actually weapons, they don't really have much practice using them. So when these guys are sort of vaguely organized on a field to take on the Turks, what do you think happens? They get massacred in enormous numbers. There are very few left, and the Turks decide to finish the job, and they actually ride into the camp where the People's Crusaders had initially been stationed, and they clean out anyone they find there as well. So it's an absolute devastation. Basically, most people in the People's Crusade are finished at this point. Some are carried off as captives or slaves. Some are forced to convert or taken prisoner. There are very few left. Peter the Hermit escapes because he wasn't actually there. So he doesn't really escape. He wasn't part of the conflict. He was in Constantinople when it unfolded. So he is going to continue on and be part of the rest of the story. But for most of the People's Crusaders, the story ends here, outside of Constantinople, as a result of disorganization, lack of skill, lack of strategy, and a general naivety about what the mission was and who they were facing. And when we think about how many people this means, historians talk about the First Crusade as involving somewhere between 80 to 100,000 people. And that number is divided roughly in half, about 40,000 of those people are accounted for by the People's Crusade. And so we're looking at 40,000 people who never even make it anywhere close to Jerusalem. Some of them die in Hungary, and a lot of them die right here across from Constantinople. That is a large number of people. The others, the other 40 or 50,000, are going to be accounted for by the Prince's Crusade, and they are still on the way. So if the First Crusade involves close to 100,000 people, which is massive, how did they all arrive in Constantinople anyway? Well, there were two main routes that people followed. And depending on where you were located in Europe and perhaps your level of wealth, you would take one rather than the other. The first was an overland route, which was by far the one that was more widely traveled. And so you would begin somewhere in Western Europe, like France or Germany. You would proceed through Central Europe and the Balkans, and then head south down towards Constantinople, which is in modern Turkey. The second route went through Italy. So you'd come down through Italy toward the south, you would take a ship, probably in Apulia, and then from there you would head across the Mediterranean, crossing into Epirus in northern Greece. And from there you would follow an ancient route, a road that used to connect people traveling from the old Roman Empire's capital in Rome to the Eastern Roman capital in Constantinople. So they would also have taken this sort of ship route, landed in Epirus, and then followed a route called the Via Egnatia into Constantinople itself. Some of the richer crusaders, or the ones who were located in Italy, went to Constantinople by this second route, but the vast majority of people followed the overland route, which meant a whole lot of walking. People came from as far as England, Scotland, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, Greece, and even Armenia. So you've got people from across Europe speaking a huge range of languages, dressing differently, coming from very, very different places in the world, and together united by this crazy quest. There were large numbers of Franks and Normans among them, because these were, of course, some of the most sought-after fighters in Europe, but there were a large range of other people as well. Now, how long a distance would it be if you were coming on the overland route? Well, let's imagine that you start, for easy reference, Paris, France, okay? Some people would be coming from farther, but it's a good sort of central point to pick. So if you're going to go from Paris to Constantinople, you're looking at 2,700 kilometers, or 1,677 miles. And you're going to be doing this on foot. Even if you were a knight with a horse, that's still a whole lot of plodding on the horse, and there'd be times you'd be walking and leading that horse. Think about how many months that would take you to do on foot. And of course, Constantinople, which is your 2,700 kilometers, is just the beginning. Once you get to Constantinople, your ultimate destination, if you're a crusader here, is Jerusalem. So the total distance from Paris to Jerusalem is something like 4,500 kilometers or 2,800 miles. So that distance is an incredible one for most of us to think about. I mean, the only people who are doing distances like that on foot today are sort of extreme athletes, ultra marathoners, people who do crazy distances as their day job. But it's incredible to imagine that many of these people, we're talking about elderly people who signed up for this, children who signed up for it, women, monks. These are people from across different groups in society who are united by their response to this call and are taking on this incredibly daunting journey. And it's going to take them years to do. And remember, even if you get to Jerusalem, then you have to get back home. Now, perhaps some of these people didn't think they were going to go home. The people who were motivated by economic factors might have thought, we're going to head over there and stay. But even if you regard this as a one-way trip, walking some 4,500 kilometers is not a joke. So I think that understanding the enormity of what people were signing up for is not often appreciated. So when the Crusaders proper, the Prince's Crusade, the knights that Pope Urban II had invited and that Emperor Alexius Comnenus so fervently desired, when they arrived in Constantinople, they were also quartered outside the city. Unlike the ragged, undisciplined, disastrous group of People's Crusaders, these all had strong leadership. There were a number of nobles who were in charge of this mission. Each of them had their own large contingent of knights and men-at-arms, so there was a very clear chain of command, and these people were far better organized. So there wasn't the sort of lawlessness and criminality that immediately showed up when the People's Crusaders arrived. Nevertheless, Emperor Alexius Comnenus was a little bit worried. After all, the knights of Western Europe were notoriously acquisitive militarily. These were people who were known to be fighting with each other all of the time and constantly looking for ways to expand their own territory. So there's a sense of, you've invited the wolf to your table here, and he might eat more than you had put on the table for him. Emperor Alexius Comnenus is worried that these people might actually launch their own attack on Constantinople and potentially dethrone him, even. Or more likely, that when he sets them loose into the empire with this mission, that they might effectively take land and cities, but then keep them for themselves. So he has serious concerns about the Prince's Crusade. They're just different concerns than the People's Crusaders presented. One of these crusaders, actually, Bohemond, who we already mentioned, that fearsome Norman warrior, was actually already at war with the Eastern Roman Empire only a few years before. He had ridden into imperial territory with his father, Robert Guiscard, heading for Constantinople. They had taken some imperial territory for themselves, and they were riding to the imperial capital, and rumor had it that Robert Guiscard wanted the imperial crown for himself. So Emperor Alexius Comnenus had reason to be worried about Western knights and Normans in particular, Bohemond most particularly of all. And Bohemond is right there as part of the Prince's Crusade. So one of the emperor's own arch enemies is now showing up outside the capital, allegedly as an ally. But you can't blame the emperor for being a little bit suspicious. To address this problem, the emperor demanded that all the leaders of the Prince's Crusade, the highest ranking nobles, the ones who commanded all of the other knights and men-at-arms, swear oaths of fealty to himself personally. And this was something that every Western knight understood. A feudal oath was one in which the knight swearing it recognized the authority of the king as his overlord and said, all of the land here ultimately belongs to you, the king. I, this person swearing the oath, am your liegeman. So the term liege lord and liegeman and my liege, which you've probably heard in countless movies about the Middle Ages, these are references to this exact relationship. So to be a liegeman of your liege lord was to have this relationship in which you owed loyalty and military service to the ruler who owned all the land and allowed you to hold some land, perhaps, or have titles and honors at his pleasure. So it's a loyalty for reward kind of scenario. This is an oath that was the foundation of Western noble society at this time, feudalism. The emperor knew that, and so he's asking these Western nobles to swear this oath to him, to acknowledge him as the one who owns the land, and also that any territory they take is going to be returned to him, the emperor, because he's the owner of the land. These knights are going to be loyal to him, the emperor. That's what the oath is about. And there are some knights who take this oath. Some of the leaders take it without much of a fuss, but some of them make problems. In particular, Bohemond. He won't take this oath until he makes a special deal with the emperor. What's that deal? Well, Bohemond negotiates with Emperor Alexius Comnenus, and he says, well, how about you make me the leader of the imperial army? And the emperor says no. Well, the position is open. I mean, Bohemond thinks that he could just have himself promoted. The emperor's not having it. But the emperor does agree that if Bohemond captures additional territory that wasn't part of territory that used to belong to the Eastern Roman Empire, so if Bohemond takes Turkish territory, he can keep that for himself. So this is kind of a win-win situation, because if Bohemond doesn't just recover imperial territory and give it back, but takes some additional territory, that becomes a buffer zone between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Turks. If Bohemond wants to carve out his own bubble between them, and it's his job to defend that from the Turks, the emperor is happy to have that buffer zone on his border. So Bohemond feels like he's won the right to carve out his own little kingdom. So he's happy about that. So then he takes the oath. But one of the guys who makes the most trouble is the highest ranking nobleman in the Prince's Crusade, Count Raymond of Toulouse, who really should be thought of as a prince, because that's really what his standing indicated. Raymond of Toulouse is kind of the elder noble. He's in his 60s at the time. He's very, very powerful. He's got a higher rank than anybody else. And his objection is basically, I don't swear oaths of fealty to anybody. I'm the guy who other people swear oaths of fealty to, right? I'm at the peak of my own feudal pyramid. I'm not bending the knee to anybody else. And Raymond goes back and forth with Emperor Alexius Comnenus about this for weeks. And he says, listen, I will promise you that I will return land to you, and I'll give you assurances of my loyalty, but I'm not going to take this formal official oath of fealty because I feel it's demeaning to me and my rank. So this is a standoff. The Crusaders aren't going anywhere until the emperor is happy. They rely on him to provision them, to ensure that their army has what it needs to survive, to give them guides, to give them intelligence. They need the emperor. And the emperor's not going to provide any of those things until he's satisfied that he's going to get what he wants, which is his own land back. Not to set loose a bunch of Western warriors on his empire to make one problem into a worse problem. So there's the standoff. Raymond of Toulouse is not making the oath, and the emperor says, well, no one's going anywhere. No one's doing anything until this is resolved. So finally, Bohemond, that belligerent Norman that we've already mentioned, intervenes, and he says to Raymond of Toulouse, listen, if you don't get on board here and sign this oath, I'm going to deal with you personally. So it's really a not so thinly veiled threat of violence that this Norman is telling this French noble that, I'll take you on. I'll fight you, perhaps. I'm going to make your life difficult. You better get on board. So Bohemond does this, and it has two effects. It, one, wins him credit with the emperor, who now thinks, oh, Bohemond, formerly our arch enemy, is now a strong-armed guy on my side. So it wins Bohemond some imperial credit, but it also wins him credit with the rest of the Crusaders, who are really impatient after traveling for weeks and months to get to Constantinople, to be sitting around the city, twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the nobles to sort out their formalities. They want to get on the road as well. So they're very happy that Bohemond has expedited the proceedings. But what this reveals is some of the violence and the rivalry between the leaders of the Prince's Crusade that is already right there just under the surface. And it's important to notice it here because we're going to see these currents shape what is going to unfold as these Crusaders get on the road and they actually begin to undertake the reconquest of land for the Eastern Roman Empire. With the formalities satisfactorily concluded, the Prince's Crusade now had the green light, and they would shortly depart from Constantinople, heading across what is now modern Turkey, and eventually going south towards Syria and eventually the Holy Land. Along the way, it would be their mission to retake several key cities, including Nicaea and Antioch. Antioch in particular would be extremely important strategically. They would need to hold that in order to proceed further toward Jerusalem. The story of what happens as they begin to make this journey is full of some of the most bizarre episodes I have ever encountered. We are going to see cannibalism. We are going to see torture. We are going to see sieges and starvation. We are going to see incredible feats of bravery against overwhelming odds, and some very surprising allies and treachery amongst the Crusaders themselves. But for all of that, you need to come back for episode 2. I hope you've enjoyed this first episode setting up the First Crusade, and I promise that the sequel to this is going to be explosive. If you've enjoyed this episode, please ensure that you're subscribed to Villains and Virgins podcast so that you don't miss what's coming next. And also, if you want even more, consider heading over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and becoming a supporter of Villains and Virgins and the podcast community. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.